Hello, everybody, and welcome back for another edition of Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arleth. As always, it's your one-stop shop to take stock of all the developments on the political and literal battlefields. Let's go ahead and start off with a review of the most important events from the past week, straight from Ukraine. Russia continues its offensive in Ukraine, taking lives, causing injuries, and unspeakable damage. Let's take a look at the toll of the last and other recent attacks.
Russian attacks across Ukraine killed at least 5 people and injured at least 33 over the past 24 hours. The Russian forces used a guided aerial bomb to carry out the attack on a retirement home in Sumy. According to the most recent updates from local authorities, 14 elderly residents of the home were injured in the attack. Unfortunately, one other was killed. At the time of the attack, some 220 people were inside the facility. Moreover, 7 people were injured and 1 person killed in Russian strikes in the Kharkiv region, just over the past 2 days. 1 person has been killed and 4 people, including a 9-year-old boy, have been injured during Russian attacks in the Nikopol district in southeastern Ukraine. The Ukrainian forces are working relentlessly to stop these attacks. On September 19th, the Ukrainian Air Force reported downing all 42 drones launched by Russia overnight, as well as 1 Kh-5969 guided air missile.
According to the Security Service of Ukraine, Ukrainian forces have carried out a successful attack on a Russian weapons depot using military drones. This could be the most successful Ukrainian strike on a Russian ammo dump since the start of the war.
The attack was carried out overnight on August 18th. The Ukrainian drones successfully targeted a weapons depot in Toropets in Russia's Tver region. In the early hours of September 18th, Russian Telegram channels were filled with photos and videos showing explosions and a large plume of smoke coming from the side of the depot. The regional governor released a report the following morning claiming that the fire was caused by falling drone debris. He added that the situation was under control. The warehouse reportedly stored ballistic missiles, including Iskanders, anti-aircraft missiles, artillery ammunition, and KAB-guided bombs. The blast from the attack was reportedly strong enough that it wiped the depot off the face of Earth.
Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski confirmed that Poland will contribute financially to the Czech ammunition coalition for Ukraine. Poland has previously pledged to provide support for the initiative, but has yet to do so.
The news was announced by the Polish foreign minister in an interview for the Ukrainian online newspaper European Pravda, published on September 15th. The minister confirmed that what he called temporary former obstacles related to the Polish State Agency for Strategic Reserves have halted Warsaw's payout. Poland reportedly plans to allocate 50 million euros to the initiative in 2024 and another 50 million euros in 2025. The initiative to purchase artillery shells for Ukraine was announced by the Czech government earlier this year. The announcement came amid shell shortages caused mainly by delays in U.S. assistance. By July 2024, the initiative has already secured funds for 500,000 rounds. Czech authorities hope to pay for 300,000 more by the end of the year. So far, 18 countries have pledged support for the initiative.
Winter is coming, and Ukraine is bracing for impact as the country continues to struggle against Russia. The resulting damage to critical infrastructure could provide for the harshest winter yet, but the International Atomic Energy Agency has a plan.
On September 19th, the IEA released a 10-step action plan dedicated to helping Ukraine survive the upcoming winter. The plan focuses on preserving the country's energy infrastructure. Much of Ukraine's power grid has been damaged by Russian attacks, and as the war drags on, it remains unclear how much of the critical infrastructure can be repaired before the seasons change. Already this summer and fall, energy deficits across the country necessitated rolling blackouts. The upcoming winter could see electricity availability decrease to some 6 to 7 hours per day for many Ukrainians. The President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, arrived in Kyiv, where she announced a financial aid package of 160 million euro to support Ukraine in its efforts to survive this winter.
As Russia continues its offensive in Ukraine, let's take a closer look at one of the most powerful tools at Moscow's disposal, which is propaganda. We'll use the screening of the film called Russians at War at the Venice International Film Festival as our case study.
The famed festival gathers thousands of movie fans every year. But this year's, the 81st edition of the Biennale, caused controversy when Russians at War, a documentary by a Russian-Canadian director, Anastasia Trofimova, was shown outside the competition program.
No screen for Russia!
But the controversies surrounding the film stretch far beyond Venice. The movie was heavily criticized by the festival's attendees and many Ukrainian voices. The film's director reportedly spent 7 months on the front lines, shadowing a Russian battalion. Historically, her presence would have had to be approved by the Russian Defense Ministry and military authorities, something Trofimova leaves out of her account.
I never went there officially. If I went through the official channels, well, first of all, I couldn't because I wasn't working for an agency. I was on my own. I didn't even have a press card at the time. So it was on the level of people. So I stayed with people. I went to the front and I just asked if I could take their stories.
One of the main criticisms towards Russians at War is that the film focuses on emotion-driven cliches and disregards the factual background of the reality it strives to present. The film focuses on personal stories of Russian soldiers, aiming to show the human face of the war. Except it fails to mention that the reason for these soldiers' presence on the front lines is Moscow's blatant and cruel assault on Ukraine's sovereignty. A Ukrainian director, whose own film about the war was also shown during the Venice Film Festival, Olha Zurba, offered a different perspective on documenting the military conflict and its fallout.
So I think that, art is too weak, and there is no language to explain this experience of war.
The approach of Russians at War is all too similar to propaganda schemes widely used by Russia as it wages not just its war on Ukraine, but also the hybrid war against the rest of the Western world.
I would love for people to see the film. And then if anyone can tell me where the propaganda is, I would love to hear it.
Russians at War was recently withdrawn from this year's Toronto International Film Festival edition due to safety concerns, in the first such case in the 49-year history of the festival. Trofimova has accused Canadian authorities of state censorship following her film's removal.
And now here joining me to discuss is Sarah Ashton-Cirillo, Sergeant Sarah Ashton-Cirillo from the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Hello, Sarah. Thanks for joining me on Ukraine This Week.
It's always great to be here with you, Don, to be speaking about the issues that are important not just to us here in Ukraine, but to our partners such as the great Polish people and everyone across NATO and the free world. So thank you for having me, especially to talk about a topic that, as you know, is very, very important when it comes to finding the pathway to victory.
Yes, and we're trying to focus a little bit on propaganda this week, and of course we see this Russians at War film be showcased at the Venice International Film Festival, and then we hear Anastasia Trofimova speak about how she's this independent filmmaker, and she didn't even have a press card in Russia, and that there's no propaganda. Sarah, I know this is something you've looked into, so give us the latest.
Well, the first statement about Anastasia Trofimova not being a member of the press is a blatant lie. Anastasia Trofimova was a credited writer for the New York Times and Washington Post in setting up stories. She has bylines in both the Washington Post and New York Times, having set up bylines for those two outlets to go to Chechnya, to go to temporarily occupied Donetsk, to go into parts of Russia that the meetings had to be set up by Maria Butina, who we know is a convicted criminal who was expelled from the United States for actions that were based off of intelligence gathering. So Anastasia Trofimova, if she was not a journalist with a press card, then let's call it what she is. She was a weapon of propaganda pushed out by the Kremlin itself.
So, how do you think that this that her film makes it into the Venice International Film Festival? I mean, is that a scandal in and of itself?
I think the real scandal has to be looked at that people such as Anastasia Trofimova can compare themselves to the artists who actually make proper documentaries. The real scandal is the fact that Anastasia Trofimova can get bylines in the Washington Post and New York Times while spouting the Kremlin's propaganda. So if we have what we term in the world of psyops or ipso useful idiot, then maybe we can look at some of these film festivals as, quote, these useful idiots who were taken advantage of by the Kremlin's propaganda machine. But we have to understand the truth. These propagandists are enemies of freedom and the free world, and that includes Trofimova herself.
Well, so what about the New York Times and Washington Post? Do you think that they were aware of kind of her dealings? Do you think that they sent her because she could have access? Why exactly you think that is? And if you remember, there was quite a while after that new Russian law passed after the full-scale invasion that all the media outlets left Russia because they were fearful for arrest of their journalists. So why do you think that she ended up working for the New York Times and Washington Post?
In a best-case scenario, they found somebody who had access. Trofimova was a conduit and a way for them to gain access in areas that they could have never received on their own. And that, again, proves her direct Kremlin ties. The Washington Post story was one of great significance in trying to understand the Kremlin's use of soft power. And what I mean by that is the Washington Post put a buried disclaimer about 6 paragraphs in, stating that they would have never been able to speak to anyone that they spoke to, for the most part, without the help of Maria Butina, the convicted Kremlin agent, convicted of crimes in the United States, who went ahead and facilitated that work between Maria Butina and the Washington Post. Well, the person who has the byline, she was involved, and that was Anastasia Trofimova. The issue with the New York Times was maybe, in a sense, even more egregious. She traveled on behalf of the New York Times from the lair of Kadyrov, from the lair of the Chechen war criminals, went from Grozny, traveled on behalf of the New York Times into temporarily occupied Donetsk, which is and always will be a part of Ukraine. And in doing so, she clearly showed that she had the access. Why and how the New York Times and Washington Post decided that it was proper to work with a Kremlin agent, I can't speak for them. Those are 2 esteemed outlets who I hope in this case truly just made a horrifically egregious mistake, but nonetheless a mistake.
Well, it seems that the Canadian government also has a hand in this. According to public information, the film was partly financed by the Canadian budget. The question arises as to how Russian services, or indeed the authorities in the Kremlin, could have allowed this female director working for money, some which came from the West, and to prepare any material on the Russian side of the front line.
That's one of the most insidious aspects of Moscow's soft power regime when they go ahead and they spread its plague, its tentacles across the Western world. So you take somebody, you approach them with an interesting idea, and next thing you know, the Canadian taxpayers are funding hundreds of thousands of Canadian dollars towards a movie that we understand the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada were rightfully aghast at, as well as those who were not part of Ukraine's community there in Canada, but simply those who understood what freedom meant. And so when we see Western money going to people who are now, by the way, in a sense sanctioned, Trofimova has been put on the Ukraine's Ministry of Culture list of folks who really have to, I don't want to use the term, but people who truly should not be taking part in the free world. And it's a little late, but nonetheless, moving forward, we hope to see that action such as this doesn't take place again.
I want to mention another scandal that's arose of late, and that is this Operation Doppelganger, which is a very complex web, if you will, that has independent links to the Kremlin, in which Basically, they spoofed many Western websites here in Poland, in Germany, the United States, the likes of Fox News, Polski Radio here in Poland, and others. They spoofed these websites, and then they put very similar addresses, internet addresses, and were able to share the links around on social media and what have you, and disseminate disinformation this way. So I guess the question now lies in the Western world is seeing that this is an obvious problem. We have the U.S. elections in the United States coming up, and these Kremlin narratives, whether they be pro-Russian news or Kremlin-friendly, are making their way onto our social media networks. So how does the West combat the rise in this disinformation? Excuse me.
When I presented in Brussels at NATO headquarters on this exact issue, I was there just a few months ago, and my suggestion was to ignore the noise and actually go on what we would call the information offensive. Because, to use the term I used a few moments ago, the tentacles of the enemy are so great that we're playing the game of whack-a-mole. We hit it and another pops up. So what we need to do is take the messaging back. We need to explain to those people who believe in the rule of law, who believe in freedom and democracy, and state to them, listen, this is what's taking place. This is what you need to understand is really what these countries are about. We shouldn't have to be trying to explain why something is wrong and give it more oxygen. We should be going out there and telling the citizens of the great countries, the great partners of Ukraine, the great partners in the NATO coalition and throughout the global south and around the globe, and explain to them, hey, this is what the Kremlin's all about. This is what Iran is all about. This is what Belarus is all about. You know better. We know better. Let's focus on victory and ignore the noise and chaos that's coming from these Kremlin propaganda factories.
Well, on the other hand, shouldn't we be responding in kind, if you will? Shouldn't we be projecting our own information campaigns toward their citizens in Russia, towards their citizens in Belarus, to make sure that people know the truth from our perspective? Because essentially, it seems like we sit down and we take it in our free societies, but we dish little out.
Well, we have efforts to do so. But unfortunately, what's taking place right now in Russia specifically, they're creating their own vertical of information. VPNs are banned. We're seeing the fact that they have, in a sense, their own internet now. And so while it's more difficult to do so, it's still possible what you're suggesting. It just won't have the reach. And therefore, instead of looking for a tit for tat, we should focus on explaining why the values of freedom matter in our battles, and to also explain to our citizenry what the enemy truly is about. Because again, if we get trapped in their web of lies and we get trapped trying to explain why they're wrong, we will go in circles. Their citizen in these countries will understand what freedom is through our actions. We don't need to rely on propaganda, Don, when we have fact and truth on our side.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with you, and I wish that fact and truth would get out to their societies to help maybe change public opinion. Sarah Ashton-Cirillo, Sergeant Sarah Ashton-Cirillo, Ukrainian Armed Forces, thank you very much. Always appreciate having you on the show. Thank you.
Slava Ukraini, and grateful as always to the Polish people for their support of our fight for victory.
All righty, thank you. And all key points of Ukraine's victory plan have now been identified. According to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, who is expected to present the plan in Washington, he said that the U.S. has accepted that plan and will encourage Western allies to do so when they are gathered in New York.
And today we can say that our victory plan has been fully prepared. All the points, all the key emphases, the necessary annexes with details to the plan have been identified. Everything has been worked out. The most important thing now is the determination to implement it.
The plan will now be presented to Washington, Kyiv's most powerful ally. Zelenskyy will discuss the details with U.S. President Joe Biden during his visit to the U.S. later this month. The meeting is expected to take place at the United Nations General Assembly in New York. Zelenskyy revealed that he would also present the plan to Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. The U.S. State Department has confirmed that the American ambassador to Ukraine is familiar with the contents of the plan already.
We were briefed on elements of the plan when we were in Kyiv last week.
Focusing on Ukraine's security and geopolitical position, foreign military assistance with the freedom to use it without restrictions, and economic support. As we wait for the details of the plan to be announced, the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has already made her way to Kyiv, where she announced a €160 million aid package to support Ukraine through the winter months. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has announced that the recent incursion into Russia's Kursk region is a part of the victory plan. There is also a fifth point in the plan related to the post-war recovery period that will eventually await Kyiv.
And now I'd like to welcome to the program Timofey Milofanov, advisor at the Office of the President of Ukraine. Hello, sir, and thank you very much for joining us on Ukraine This Week.
Hello.
Now, discussing what's ahead of us over the next week or so, UN General Assembly, you're going to have world leaders assembling there in New York. This gives President Zelenskyy a perfect opportunity to present his plan. Most likely, he's already presented this plan to some degree to the United States side. And we also know that it's highly secretive. So if you could just give us a few comments on exactly what you think this plan could entail, besides the secret parts that we don't know.
Yeah, so absolutely. The details of the plan are going to be revealed in New York or Washington. And during the meeting of President Zelenskyy with President Biden, President Zelenskyy also would like to speak to the presidential candidates and try to, I think, in my view, bypass the partisanship or the partisan politics currently in Washington and the United States, to argue successfully, in my view, that aggressive Russia presents a broader threat to national security interests of the United States and the entire free world. And so it transcends beyond the politics, shouldn't be a political issue of domestic politics in particular. Now, what are the elements? The elements, of course, are what kind of leverage Ukraine has over Russia and the free world has over Russia that can ensure sustainable peace. We want to make sure that whatever will be the outcome of the peace, when it happens, the war doesn't restart after a little bit or after several years. And I think rightly so, Kursk and also ability of Ukraine to target Russia using Ukrainian weapons and maybe also Western weapons, attack its military infrastructure, oil refineries, and the ability of Ukraine to enter into Russian territory to create buffer zones and protect itself are all elements of the leverage. Then there is leverage over Crimea, there is leverage over the Black Sea, and so any settlement will require some kind of split of leverages. Ukraine continues to insist that all the territories have to be brought back, but now Ukraine has something to trade.
Certainly it does. And President Zelenskyy said the operation in Kursk is definitely part of this plan. According to a report today, this plan is 90% complete, and Kyiv is preparing to present it to the allies next week. Now, also what has been previously stated by President Zelenskyy was participation of Ukraine in the global security infrastructure. If we can take these few words and maybe break them down a little bit, what do you think President Zelenskyy means by this statement?
Well, there are at least three aspects to it. One is that defense tech and defense industry of Ukraine now has been developed significantly. The second element of this is that the military, the armed forces, and also the research and development teams understand they are in the good position to understand the Russian capabilities to develop its technology, specifically arms and weapons further, the ability to understand the tactics and strategy of Russia on the battlefield. And so we have trained military, we have trained commanders, we have experienced people who understand the modern warfare. So that's an important element of that. And then there is also leadership and resilience. So Ukraine has to offer a lot, not only in terms of capabilities, but in terms of understanding how to build resilience of the economy, of the military, of the society during difficult times during the invasion. So all of these capabilities are helpful to NATO, and not only NATO, to the global security of the world. And Ukraine can be a player in this at the political level, at the diplomatic level, but also at the very down-to-earth technical level.
Putting pressure on Russia to end the war by diplomatic means is also another point. Just a little tidbit from me. I was with Poland's foreign minister on his trip to Asia, very similar trip to what President Zelenskyy did at the beginning of the summer. And of course, Foreign Minister Sikorsky was really on a mission to be a really big cheerleader for Ukraine, of course, explaining how this is important to the global South. But he said something that really struck my mind, and this is that China, with one phone call, could probably end this conflict or this war by tomorrow if they would choose to do the right thing. So do you think this might be part of the plan as well, to get China on board, because they would be essential?
It is also true that China is a critical player in this environment, and of course peace is possible without China involvement, but China indeed, maybe with one phone call or maybe with five, can end it, because Russia now, Putin is the president who has lost, the first president or the first leader of Russia who has lost the wars both in the West and in the East. And what it means is that he is now very dependent on the goodwill of China. China has a lot of leverage, first of all, in the economy to continue to support Russia. And if China disengages, Russia will go in a deep crisis, deep economic crisis. So in that sense, yes, China has this leverage and can end the war quickly. Now, China wants something too, and one of these elements that it wants is to be recognized globally as the powerful player who can end the war, while the West has not been able to do that. So, and I think that's where a sticking point is at the geopolitical level. That's not the only point, but I think that's the most important point.
Okay, and then of course I'd like to go back to the Crimea summit that was just recently, and Turkey saying that Crimea belongs in Ukrainian hands. I'd like to get your response to that. Is this a big development? Because Turkey is quite a player, especially in the Black Sea region. It has been since the beginning of the war, before the war, and it continues to be so. Was this very welcome words from President Erdogan?
Yes, so Turkey has always been very clear on Crimea. Because there is an important constituency for Turkey in Crimea. It's Crimean Tatars, who are being oppressed by Russia. They've been persecuted politically and physically, and they're being tortured, their property being confiscated, and they're being actually pushed out of Crimea. In the very same way that Stalin did with Crimean Tatars during the Soviet Union, when deported them, and they came back after the Soviet Union collapsed. So it's a national tragedy for Crimean Tatars, and Crimean Tatars are connected, well connected, and has a strong diaspora in Turkey, and a lot of voters in Turkey care about what happens with Crimean Tatars. So the leadership of Turkey has always been very, very clear on Crimea and on support to Crimean Tatars. And therefore, I think these are very good and welcome developments. These are welcome words, so that this issue is made public.
I'd also like to ask about the situation. Well, right now you have this offensive still going on in Kursk, so it gives, as you mentioned, it is somewhat of a bargaining chip. But we still have all of Luhansk and a good chunk of Donetsk that is, it's occupied. So if let's leave Crimea aside for a minute, and then of course Kherson and parts of Zaporizhia. So Looking at the current situation, it seems like Ukraine has a little bit too less land to be able to swap for what Russia currently has. And so what do you think are going to be the points to move forward as far as these areas of Ukraine go and how to negotiate this?
Yeah, but in my view, in negotiations and politics, the specific size of the land is much less important. It's not a commercial deal where we are trading, hectare for hectare, or acre for acre. Mm-hmm. The issue is whether Ukraine can hold Russian land, and it can. And so I think the swap or the leverage is about Russian land for Ukrainian land. Now, that depends, of course, on how valuable it is, Ukrainian land occupied by Russia to Russia. Unfortunately, a lot of this land has been destroyed. Towns razed to the ground. People left, some of deported. But of course, there are still over 1 million of people living in occupied territories in terrible conditions. So from the economic perspective, and even political perspective, for Russia, it's more of a burden. So Russia needs to conduct a face-saving exercise because no one in Russia cares truly about people in Donbass. This is all just for propaganda. And there is not much left in terms of real cities in that area. So Russia might not even be rationally that interested in this territory. So the question is really how to generate a sustained peace where Russia would either give up territory or Ukrainian will take this territory back.
Opinion polls for quite a long time have shown that Ukrainians have not wanted to negotiate and give up any land. Do you think that Ukrainian society is aware that at this stage that the armed conflict seems to be unsolvable and that they're more, more open to some kind of settlement?
So there has been a recent piece in the journal, in the Wall Street Journal, arguing that Ukrainians are moving towards the willingness to trade land for peace. But sociologists have verified the results, and this are based on surveys, and they are being misinterpreted. Mm-hmm. There's actually confounding factors. What we see is that there is not much dynamics. And while in the Western media and the free world media, the framing often is about territory, for Ukrainians, it's about two things, which are not per se territory. It's about people left behind or captured by territories. And the second one is about sustainability of any peace, whether we will see Russia invading again in several years. So Ukrainians are pretty strong on making sure that whatever is the peace agreement, which will be, it will be sustainable. And Ukrainians want to make sure that Ukrainians who live in occupied territories are freed. They are not being tortured. Civilians, over 30,000 civilians are estimated to be actually in Russian prisons, are released and exchanged. Prisoners of war are exchanged. Children who have been kidnapped and deported are returned. So that's what Ukrainians want. What will happen in reality often depends both on politics, on diplomacy, but also on the forces, on the outcome on the ground.
Certainly does. And of course, if land was to be seized or ceded, that would set a very dangerous precedent and probably wouldn't create the conditions for a lasting peace.
That's exactly the concern. The worry is that Russia should learn from this war that it's not wars invading a sovereign country in the future. And that's, I think, in everyone's interest, in everyone in the EU, everyone in the world, that Russia, with its aggression, doesn't have incentives to do it again in the future.
Well, I would hope that at any settlement that the discussion about Ukraine immediately joining NATO would be expedited, or at least a real, serious security guarantee would be given to Ukraine by the West and the United States to make sure that this indeed never happens again. Well, Timothy Milofanov, advisor to the President of Ukraine, thank you very much for joining us this week. We very much appreciate your thoughts. And that concludes this edition of Ukraine This Week. Join us again next week for another summary of all the latest events from the war in Ukraine. Thanks for watching, and see you soon. Goodbye.